This is the book we're talking about tonight. It's In Defense of Civilization. Hopefully, you'll all go out and buy a copy. Can you write down that title? Everybody's got that. Hopefully, it's in focus, sort of. A great book. It's a 100-mile rip through history, and Michael's going to be talking about that tonight. So I'll just read his bio off his flap here. Michael Jackson Bonner is a Canadian political advisor and historian of Iran. He studied classical and Oriental languages in undergrad and took a master's degree and doctorate in Iranian history from the University of Oxford. He has advised members of cabinet in both federal and provincial Canadian governments and lives in Toronto with his family. He is also a contributing editor to the Dorchester Review, and this title is actually produced by Ken White's organization. Many of you know Ken White. He was at the original Winds of Change conference for Civitas, and he's been involved with Civitas on and off throughout the years. I think he was one of the founding editors for National Post, wasn't he, Andy? Andy probably would know that. Yeah, he's saying yes. So with that, Dr. Bonner is going to speak to us for about somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions in question period, and we'll try to wrap up at the top of the hour. So with that, I'd ask you all to mute yourself, and actually I could probably mute those of you who aren't muted. With that, Dr. Bonner.
Thanks very much, and it's a great honor to be here tonight and to have been invited. I never pass up an opportunity to really talk about anything or to talk at all. So I'm happy to do it also, and I'm very grateful for the interest in my book. When I decided that I wanted to write a book, it was at the sort of early days of the pandemic in 2020. I needed something to do, and it was the founder and editor of the Dorchester Review, Chris Champion, and we were having a phone call and just sort of complaining about everything. And I was sort of rattling off a list of things that I thought had gone very poorly, over the past several hundred years. And then we sort of extended the range sort of further and further back. And then eventually he asked me, well, is there anything that you think that went right at all? Did anything ever go well? And I thought, well, you know what? I'll think about that, and maybe I'll get back to you. And we talked again, and eventually the idea for a book sort of took shape about sort of where we are now, roughly speaking, how we got there, what happened along the way, and where we started. And that was a sort of impetus for a book about human civilization. And it is, I cover a lot of different historical periods, different times, different forms of art, architecture, philosophical systems, what have you. But the emphasis is really on the West, and what I think has gone wrong, sort of, here within living memory, and further back in European and North American history. But the book begins in the Upper Paleolithic era, long, long ago, before there was anything that could be called civilization. And this is important because obviously we have to try, at the very least, we have to pose the question, what is civilization? Famously posed and then not answered by Kenneth Clark, the art historian who made the 1969 series Civilization, which was obviously a big influence on me and on the book. And there's a sense in which the book is sort of in dialogue with that series. So he poses that question, what is civilization, and then doesn't answer it. Now, obviously, answering that question in some sort of abstract definition, I don't think that that's going to work. And even if it did, it probably wouldn't be a very satisfying answer or explanation as to um, what all civilizations have in common, or what makes them what they are, how they came about, and what life was like before them. I think a more reliable guide to that kind of, if that's the kind of insight we want, is to look at um, art and material culture, especially in very, very ancient times. And then later on, we can also add literature and things like that, music even. So I open in the Upper Paleolithic, when there was nothing that we would call civilization or settled life or permanent dwellings, but there was a great deal of art. In fact, during the Upper Paleolithic period, in the Ice Age, this was a period of maybe 40 odd thousand years. It was by far the most productive period of art, and probably also music, that humanity has ever experienced. Maybe 45,000 years. And you can look at the cave paintings in Lascaux or in Altamira and many other places, and you can see evidence of this. Our very ancient ancestors certainly had an eye for beauty and symmetry and so forth. They have clearly a desire, although we don't exactly understand their motivations, they have a desire to depict what they see in the world. And we know from finding figurines or from bone flutes and fragments of clothing and so forth, that, there was some sense of what we would now call art. But what's significant about it is what isn't there. There are no pictures of people that we would consider to be particularly competent or accurate. They're sort of very crude stick figures in comparison with the very beautiful animals that you see rushing on the cave walls. There are no pictures of groups of people. There are no images of the sun or the moon. There's no landscape. There's no image of anything, even animals, that is clearly standing on the ground. There's no horizon or anything like that. They seem to sort of float in space. And then at a certain point in human history, this changes. It's really quite a sudden change, considering how long was spent in the Upper Paleolithic. Suddenly, art is very different. Suddenly, you start to see scenes that depict social cooperation. There is a very distinct moment when the first horizon is drawn, or where figures appear very clearly rooted on the ground. And art continues to develop, and it reaches something that you might consider maturity, if not actually a kind of perfection, in, say, a very early dynastic Egypt or in Mesopotamian art. So what has happened between these two periods? Well, what I'm calling civilization has taken shape, has taken root, and human society has changed. Now, it is obviously difficult to describe exactly, very difficult to characterize exactly what that change is or was and what caused it. But none of the old explanations actually work. The most famous one is the so-called agricultural revolution. I think probably all of us were raised, if we ever had any anthropology or in school classes, this was always the standard narrative, that agriculture was discovered, a domestication happened, and then human beings had to settle down. Well, this isn't true, because the earliest evidence of settled life comes thousands of years before the full development of agriculture. And agriculture and domestication were very gradual processes. Anyway, the very earliest sites that we've found most famously a site called Göbekli Tepe, which is now it's in what is now southern Turkey. This is a very old site, 10,000 years old, and yet it is a settlement. It is arguably the world's first town, and yet the hunting and gathering economy is still going on around it. There's some kind of rudimentary agriculture, and there's probably something approaching some rudimentary forms of animal husbandry also. But the point is that the settlement came first. And recently there was a discovery also in Turkey, in the Fertile Crescent, at a place called Boncuklu Tarla, which is even older. This site is basically right at the end of the Ice Age. So far older than the oldest sites that we've yet found, and a good 5,000-6,000 years older than agriculture. So what this tells me is that there's no economic or technological change that brings about what we call civilization. It's something more like a change of attitude or outlook. And again, this is very hard to characterize, but you can see the result of the change of attitude or outlook when you look at material culture and the sense that it conveys of what we might call, or what I think we would call, a sense of history and a sense of shared ancestry going back into the past. It's embodied in signs of a cult of ancestors, that skulls are venerated and people are burying their ancestors under their houses. Their houses are consistently built and rebuilt according to a fixed plan, generation after generation. And you see this in a very famous site called Çatalhöyük, also in Turkey, but much further north in Anatolia. This is a town that would have been maybe 11,000 inhabitants or so. Large enough that there would be some, you would know most people, but there would still be some anonymity. All of the houses are grouped together, famously reconstructed in such a way that everybody probably had to walk on the roofs of the houses to get from place to place. But you see over the course of 1,000 years or so, signs of really strong stability. And the houses are very similar to one another, but each one is sort of amassing its own sort of internal history, unique wall paintings or hunting trophies and other sort of artifacts that would, after a couple of generations, they would all be taken down. The walls would be plastered over and repainted exactly as they were. The hearth would go back into exactly the same spot, and everything would be put back exactly as it was. So this is a symbol of historical continuity, of sort of lineages maintaining their own connection with history and sort of personal or sort of family symbols over a long period of time. And there's no evidence of any kind of central government or bureaucracy or great deal of sort of state-like control. In fact, there's no evidence of a state at all. There must have been some kind of public order there, but the point is that a fixed, permanent dwelling, a town, basically, has taken shape with a sort of interlocking households with a sense of common ancestry and sort of personal histories. So at some point, at the end of the Ice Age, our ancestors discovered history. They discovered a sense of time. They discovered their place in the world, and the material culture reflects it. That's the origin of civilization. Now, from civilization, many other things arise. If you look at the earliest Egyptian art from the Old Kingdom, say one of the very well-appointed tombs, if you think about it, you will imagine rows and rows of very elegant hieroglyphs on the wall, beautiful scenes depicting daily life, figurines showing people going about their business, or images of the person and his family buried there with sort of grave goods. The famous tomb of King Tutankhamun probably comes to mind, but this that's relatively new in comparison with the Old Kingdom. What kind of a society does this represent? Well, first of all, it's obviously idealized, but what are the ideals? I boil these down to three principles in the book. The ideals are clarity, beauty, and order. Now, the sense of clarity takes shape in the very elegant and clear presentation of hieroglyphs, describing the past, describing the deeds of the person or the accomplishments or doings of his time and so forth. And not only do they represent a language, but they also are pictures. So there's a sense that the world can be clearly understood through images and sounds and so forth. The sense of beauty, we don't really have a good word for the kind of beauty that I'm thinking of in English. It's more something like harmonious proportion. It isn't a sense of simply being attractive. It is attractive and pleasing to us because the art is executed according to measurement, according to canons of proportion. And you see that both in Egypt and in Mesopotamian art very early on. And the third is order, these scenes depicting the natural world and the human affairs and so forth, that there is some organizing principle that has been inferred within the world, that mankind has a place within this order. There's both a political order on earth, represented by the monarch and the government and so forth, but there's also an invisible spiritual order that takes shape within religion also. These are the three principles that I infer from the earliest civilized material culture. They take shape quite suddenly. They are found together. They inform one another. And I use them throughout the book as sort of rubrics, if you like, to look at all the art, material culture, and some of the philosophy and so forth of other expressions of human civilization over time. And I think it's useful as a sort of means of comparison to show how these things change and how they can, reach a peak or deteriorate and so forth as civilization ebbs and flows. Now, on the topic of ebbing and flowing, our ancestors took for granted this idea that civilized life did exactly that it would sort of grow, reach maturity, and then it would decay. And it would not always decay and fall apart because of some kind of violent catastrophe, although that did happen. The Egyptian Old Kingdom fell apart very gradually after a good 700 years or so, because of things like regional separatism and sort of the breakdown of the central government. So there was no sort of violent catastrophe, but sooner or later, everything falls apart. Now, in the case of Egypt, the state itself and the Egyptian civilization sort of rose and fell as a unit. Something similar happened in China throughout its history also. In Mesopotamia, though, you have several different states that are sort of cycling through sort of rise and fall, whilst a common Mesopotamian civilization sort of flows along underneath. And you have sort of multiple different dynasties, different languages, different cultures, and so forth. But still, there's a distinctly Mesopotamian sort of spirit to it all the way through. Now, I think that a good comparison with that is actually what you might call European or Western civilization. That there are many different dynastic orders, different sort of empires and kingdoms have risen and fallen, many different languages, a great deal of different cultures and so forth, but still a common spirit underneath. China, again, would be a contrast with that. Now, I also thought that it was very important in the book to prove this idea of rise and fall and decay and collapse. It was very unfashionable for a good portion of the 20th century to suggest, for example, that the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a catastrophe. Now, if you think about it, for people in the 20th century who lived through 2 world wars to conclude that, I think that's exceedingly odd. But that in much academic scholarship, that idea was rejected. Instead, it was replaced with an idea of a sort of perpetual evolution, that the collapse of Western Rome wasn't really the end of anything so much as it was a beginning, and that it didn't have a sort of spectacular fall so much as a fade out or a sort of transformation into something new. But if you actually look at the evidence, and of course we have much more evidence now than we ever did before, ice core samples show that the level of industrial activity in Western Europe completely disappeared and went back to a prehistoric level after the fall of Rome. The Germanic invaders are described doing all kinds of horrible and dreadful things, and like it or not, the civilization of Western Europe is no longer recognizably Roman. It had to have ended at some point, and this kind of total collapse, although it is perhaps not necessarily the rule in human history, it does happen. It has happened many times. One could argue that Eastern Europe in the Second World War provides an example of something very close to that, or the multiple collapses of Chinese dynasties, I think, come very close to that. However, the high watermark of total, complete, and utter collapse is the so-called Bronze Age collapse, which occurred at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1170 something BC. You have an entire world system that just completely disappears. I say completely. I mean, in Egypt, they managed to survive and hobble on a bit, but in the Mediterranean world, the collapse was so total that the old Mycenaean civilization completely disappeared. Writing was forgotten and had to be rediscovered, and so little of the past was remembered that what came after the sort of Greco sort of Greek civilization that arose after that is very, very remote from what came before. There are sort of reminiscences of it within the Iliad and the Odyssey, but they're very much incomplete. And if you read the early parts of Thucydides, it's clear that not very much managed to survive. So for us living now, it may be hard to imagine, but a total, complete collapse in which the amenities of civilization are completely forgotten, that is an option. That is a possibility. And I think that we've had a taste of it in the two world wars. But it's something that we need to be reminded of. At least when I was growing up, this idea was laughable. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the idea that the West could somehow falter and decay or something was sort of considered laughable. And of course, we have the example of the rather exaggerated misinterpretations of Francis Fukuyama that led people to conclude that there was nothing for anybody left to do and Western civilization would just sort of continue to drift on forever. So again, that's a misinterpretation, but it's, you know, it's worth, it was nevertheless very influential and it's worth debunking that. But the other lesson is that civilization has always managed to come back. Obviously, the forms of material culture change, tastes change, people's attitudes change from time to time, but we have never permanently reverted to a kind of upper Paleolithic like existence of wandering, hunting and gathering, or you know, there's, I don't think that there's a single instance in which writing was permanently forgotten and then never developed again, or that you know, the earliest states in Mesopotamia, they didn't just collapse and that was the end. There was still an effort to sort of revive them and continue to prolong the legacy of the previous dynasty and the old civilization. And there, I think, is an important truth, which is that the way, obviously I'm grossly oversimplifying, but to put it as broadly as possible, the way civilization has returned is by imitation. Now that may seem like not only a gross simplification, but also a kind of fatuously obvious fact. Well, it's the kind of fact that we need to be reminded of, because in our culture at the present moment, the last thing that anybody would ever take seriously, it seems, is the idea that renewal would take the form of imitating something old. The so-called techno-optimists who all recognize that something is wrong, they place their faith in some kind of future state, in some kind of technological evolution, or in some new discovery of something that will, you know, pull us forward, they think. Now, I'm not going to say that there have never been any good innovations. Obviously, there have been, but innovation must take place within a certain framework, I think, in order for it to be effective and actually useful. And that framework is, for lack of a better word, I would call it, it's one that emphasizes continuity. It emphasizes a connection with the past and a sort of sense that, it's not a sense that we are sort of hurtling blind into the future, but rather that we have our focus on the past, on being rooted in place and time, and proceeding into a future which will hopefully resemble the past and the present as much as possible. And of course, as I said earlier, that is ultimately the change of attitude that gave us civilization. And if you think it through, that would imply that the approaching it from the reverse would produce the opposite effect. And I believe that we have seen this in our own time. The sort of utopian visions of a world completely remade according to, say, rational principles or some sort of new perfectionist scheme that, you know, a lot of people will blame the the Enlightenment for this, which is largely fair, but there are older antecedents to it also. You know, Thomas More's Utopia. He's not alone in having written such a work in and around the age of discovery. It was a whole genre of utopian literature that comes out of the end of the Middle Ages and the sort of Reformation and age of discovery. And we have this trend within Western civilization, as far as I know, this tendency towards utopian thinking is not well attested elsewhere, or at least not as well attested. And it reached a peak first in revolutionary France, and then later in the 20th century. If you look at the art and the philosophy of the early 20th century in and around, say, the First World War, there is a trend towards extreme, I would say, extreme subjectivity and futurism. Futurism is, of course, a well-attested art movement, but there were also there's a great deal of futurist literature, plays, poems, and so forth, which mercifully nobody reads anymore. You'll still see the art in galleries and so forth. And the futurist outlook is still one of the dominant spirits in the contemporary West. It is the spirit of Silicon Valley. It is the spirit of contemporary progressivism, which of course comes out of first the Enlightenment and early 20th century movements. How would I describe futurism? Well, you can Google some of the art to see what it's like. Google some futurist art and then Google some Paleolithic cave art and see if you notice anything similar. There's this sense of, in both, there's this sense of energy and movement and vitality, which is certainly, it can be arresting. It can be almost frightening. It's very palpable in both forms of art. But it doesn't convey any sense of rootedness or permanence or stability. And that's exactly what the futurists were opposed to. The Futurist Manifesto, which came out in 1909, is a very frightening document. If you could read it in 1909, and if you knew what was coming in the first half of the 20th century, you probably would have done whatever you could to put a stop to it. The author of it was a man by the name of Marinetti. He describes this profound urge to destroy the past, to uproot everything that had come before, to sort of fling himself and his contemporaries into the future at the speed of a racing car, which is the fastest thing anybody had known at the time, I guess. And he talks about destroying cities, burning down libraries, and so forth. That's basically the history of the first half of the 20th century. And it could not, by any means, be called civilized. It represents what we are capable of, a kind of reversion to barbarism when we are uprooted from when we are uprooted from place and time and history and so forth.
Michael, can we bring it to ground in the next minute or so? I know people
Certainly.
will be desperate to pepper you with questions.
Certainly. So what I would say is that this movement has not abated. And it is a good time, I think, to turn back and to recognize that sense of place, purpose, and rootedness is ultimately what is going to civilize us, to make us more fully human, and to give us some sort of anchor, rootedness, some sort of point of reference in a world in which, in a world that has changed so much, and in which now technology is capable of threatening our humanity more than ever before. And as we look at headlines and see that the words civilization, the West, and so forth are back, this is why I think this discourse is important. And hopefully, hopefully, I've given some people at least, another way of thinking about it or talking about it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Bonner. This is his book. Go out and buy it. It's a 100-mile-an-hour rip through history, so it's very, very exciting. I think you'll enjoy